Alright, so I'm Suitonia. I've been playing E for about 8 years. I've only really been, I guess, famous for about the past 2 years when I started doing the Evis Easy channel and mostly focusing on low SP frigates and ships that new players can fly with a few months of training. I'm in the Alliance Warlords of the Deep. Previously Hydra Reloaded, but that alliance has mostly gone insolvent. I'm still pretty much Hydra, and I've been playing the game for about 8 years, like I said. And at the moment, I'm mostly just trying to show everyone just how successful low SP characters can be, and that skill points aren't very important. And normally just the first 1 to 2 million skill points are the most important, and you can still kill veterans in the game if you know all the matchups and you know what ships are capable of and that sort of thing.
Okay, cool. So, your presentation today is on the 17-day hero. At least that's what we were told. So let's get started with that. Like, what all is involved with that?
Right, so I always like to prove to people that you can be successful with low SP characters. You don't need much skill points at all, as long as you are aware of the matchups, you know what weaknesses each ship has and the strengths of your ship. And so it's sort of been like a free tier process, really. The first low SP character video I really did was a Kestrel video, and that when I did the video for that, it was 2 to 3 months initially, and then the big video that has about 30,000 views on YouTube now, it had about 4 months of training, but that was only with 4 to 5 million SP. That was mostly training without implants and no remaps or anything like that, and that was really successful. So what I really wanted to try to replicate that. And for Christmas, CCP gave away the 20 days free training. So I actually started theory crafting a lot of characters that you could train in 20 days and to make them as strong as possible. And I really settled on the Executioner because Scorch kiting is really strong, and especially if you can just fight players that just use Void or use blasters or use the wrong ammo type against you, you can kill even like sabers in an executioner if they load hail and things like that. And that's my most successful video so far in that 20-day character. But there was a few points of criticism on that video about how I funded it with my main essentially, because I sent 100 million ISK to it, even though 100 million ISK isn't really a lot. People were still mentioning that, and I used implants as well, plus early plus threes to get it to that point for the 20 days. And so I spent a long time sort of theory crafting and trying to come up with a trial account character that I could use, because trial accounts also have another restriction in the fact that they cannot use Tech 2 guns at all. And I wanted to make it completely self-fund, so I wouldn't send any IS to it from my main and I'd play on it. And I'd also limited myself to only playing like 10 hours a week as well, so it wasn't like I was grinding for 40 hours a week or anything like that. And the Rifter 2 is also a really underestimated ship, which is another good point as well. It's actually not as bad as people think, especially when you consider Tech 1 guns. I think autocannons actually have the best Tech 1 guns. The weakness of autocannons, I think, is the long reload time and the fact that Hail and Barrage are not as strong as Scorch, Conflagration, Null, and Void, for example. And the Rift also works out really well because it has the fall off bonus. With Limitar Frigate level 4, you get 40% fall off bonus. And as you know, Barrage is, or some of you may know, Barrage is a 40% fall off bonus. So essentially, on a new character in a Rifter, you are basically turning all of your ammo into Barrage by flying a Rifter. And the Rifter also has a lot of advantages in that it's also quite fast as well. It's the fastest combat frigate in the game. It's actually pretty close to the Condor. I think it's actually only like 100 ms slower than a Condor, so it's actually pretty quick. So it can survive gate camps a lot and things like that. And capless weapons also help out a lot. You don't need to train controlled burst out, controlled burst, which is the skill that reduces your cap at all. And you also don't need very good cap skills to fly the Rifter. You only really need them like a level 3, so you can run your rep and run your micro warp drive enough to get the charges off. But other than that, And another reason that the Rifter is really good as well, as I mentioned, it's really underestimated, and a lot of veteran players will just make mistakes against you. Like you'll see, like just a load of tacklers that just approach me, and like ships that will just load void, and they'll get kited by me indefinitely, even when they could have reloaded or used drones and things like that. And just knowing the strengths of your ships as a new character, you can prevail against veterans with max skills. And really, the thing I want to prove most of all is that skill points in EVE Online are not as essential as people make them out to be. I know that recently, in the past 2 weeks, there's been like a lot of I don't want to say whining, but there's been a lot of like threads about how much SP is needed and how much it is a barrier to entry, and I agree with it. And I've also been sending like some like messages to on the CCP Slack in the Armchair Generals channel complaining about SP and things like that, and CCP Rise has recently made a post about they want to extend the new character SP to 1 to 2 million ISK, and I hope that my videos have like made a good impression on that, especially as CCP Rise did feature my Kestrel fit in the '07 show as well.
I have a question, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Is there an easy way that you differentiate between what a strength and weakness is on a ship, just sort of at a glance? You mentioned with Rifters, it being the fall off is an easy one, but like separating that from things that may not be so obvious. Like the Incursus has a rep bonus, but a lot of fits seem to not use that in favor of other things. So is there a kind of easy way to look and just be like, okay, well, that bonus is garbage, I don't really want that, but this one is extremely valuable?
Right, the main thing is just knowing all the ships and what bonuses they have. So using the Incursus, for example, the Incursus is really powerful because it has a damage bonus and it has a rep bonus, so it's a really effective brawler, but it doesn't have a projection bonus at all. So, for example, in a Rifter versus an Incursus, the Rifter can kite at 7 kilometers, and the Rifter is faster than the Incursus as well. Especially Incursus is often fit a cap boost instead of a web, so you're in no danger at all. You can just kite at 7 kilometers. If he permatanks you, leave fight. And the disadvantage of the Incursus mostly is that it has such horrible projection most of the time. You can just kill the drone and kite at 7 kilometers, and the Incursus is quite slow compared to the Rifter, so you can just kite it at 7-8 kilometers, leave if you're in danger. If he doesn't have a web and he's just in like a perma rep fit, you can just leave because you won't be webbed and he will be webbed, and you can just coast out scram and web range.
So in other words, just bonuses dictate tactics, more or less?
Yeah, mostly. Like, for example, the Kestrel has a velocity bonus on the missiles, which the Condor and the Breacher do not get. So the Kestrel, when fighting those two missile ships, is going to try and kite at 7 to 8 kilometers or further out because it wants to deny Tech 2 missiles, because range missiles on rockets is 8 kilometers with max skills. So if the Kestrel can sit at like 8.5 kilometers, or even within 8 kilometers if it's moving away, because of how missiles work, because they're spawned in space when you launch them. So if you're moving away from the missile ship, you effectively reduce the missile range. And so, for example, a Kestrel will be using that velocity bonus to its advantage to prevent the ships that it's fighting, the Breacher and the Condor, from using Tech 2 rage rockets, which would apply to it. And instead, the Kestrel is able to use those Tech 2 missiles, and the Breacher and the Condor will not be able to use them against it. And vice versa, obviously the Breacher and the Condor do not get the velocity bonus, and the Kestrel's always going to apply DPS to them, so they both want to get on top of the Kestrel. And just understanding the matchups like that, and like what ships have utility highs, what ships have projection bonuses, what ships have rep bonuses, what's the typical fits for these ships. I know it's a lot of like knowledge to begin with, but once you know that, it gets a lot easier. And just looking at the ship bonuses is a pretty good way to find out what ships will be trying to doing, because most of the time you just want to use the bonuses to the maximum effect.
I have another unrelated question. So, in a lot of your videos, you seem to find really good places for finding lone targets such as interceptors and stuff, like what are some good regions of null to roam, and like how do you find them?
A lot of times the regions change because different people move into different areas and alliances deploy and things like that. Generally, I find the best regions are usually regions that are quite active, that are close to like NPC stations that you can use, because generally they're all a lot of null 6 space that has been like changed hands recently, because usually they have a bunch of scepters lying around there because they used to just having like scepters there for doctrine fits if they need them, if there's a call for scepters or something like that. And it's mostly a trial and error thing. The cool thing about frigates and interceptors is that they warp so fast that you can clear the map quite quickly, and it's very easy for you to make like a set of bookmarks and to map out a region in like an hour or so. And I think a good way to get fights is mostly just to keep putting up pressure and just being as visual as possible. So what I do a lot is that I'll tackle ratters and miners, even though I have no hopes in killing them at all, just to like make them post in intel, make them post in help, and just like warp around to stations. Even if there's like an author sitting on the station or something, I'll just sit aligned and then warp out when he's there. I think just being visual and just being in people's faces and just showing them that they need to bring an interceptor or frigate to catch you, and just that you're not going to back away. You're not like some travel fit dude that's just passing through. You're going to try and disrupt them as much as you possibly can. That usually forces them to bring out like frigates and interceptors to be able to deal with you.
All right, thanks.
I have another one kind of in that same vein. Now I'm sure that knowing how to fly your ship factors, mostly into being able to get the kills, but do you make like an actual attempt at like a psychological factor with sort of like pressing people to undock a scepter to try and catch you, just kind of getting them to tunnel vision, I guess you would say? I mean, would you say that plays a large factor into you getting kills?
Yeah, just if as long as you're fast and you're aggressive and you're a visual threat, I think that you force them to have to bring scepters to respond to you. I think a lot of PvE style minded players, normally what they do is they just like undock some battleship or something and bring it to a gate that you can't kill, and they know you can't kill it, and they just try to like force you out of their system. And so it's not, if you're like really active and you just like, if you're inside a pocket, for example, you're just like going between the systems really fast, and they're not going to be able to like catch you with like some random cruiser or something, and you're just constantly in a frigate, because you can warp so fast and you can align so quickly, you can cover a lot of systems really fast. So you can pretty much like complete, if they're really risk adverse and they're not bringing the right ship to kill you, you can basically just keep warping between like systems in a pocket, and you can shut down an entire pocket in a frigate if they're risk averse, and eventually it'll force them to bring out frigates and interceptors to deal with you. Sometimes they just camp you into their own space, and that happens as well, but a lot of the time you can run bad camps, and if they do camp you in, then you can just shut down their entire pocket by whooping around if they're risk averse.
I'm saying, like if someone comes at you in an interceptor and they go for the tackle, do you find that like there's a good 1 or 2 seconds where people are just sort of like dumbfounded and don't know what to do when you just like suddenly you took the fight?
Who?
Like that gives
Me
you a tactical
or them?
advantage? Them. That like a rifter is suddenly coming at them aggressively.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't expect there is a psychological factor, obviously, of the character that I'm using, because it looks like a noob, and they think that they can kill it with a crow at 0 MS on a gate, and it's just like some random free kill. But yeah, I think a lot of time it's not so much a psychological factor as it is they're in fleet with some other dudes, but they don't realize like how far away the other people are because they're not communicating correctly. And normally these type of players they don't usually have like very good comm discipline or stuff like that. So for example, there might be like 2 hacks in warp to this scepter that I'm fighting, but I've killed him and walked off by the time they even land.
Is it usually like a matter of chance that their friends won't arrive in time, or does it usually work out the way you planned?
Well, a lot of the time you can use things like directional scanner, and you can try and bait things like, for example, one strategy that I use a lot is warping to the furthest away planet in the system, especially planets that don't have many celestials around them, like asteroid belts and moons and things like that, because it's more obvious which planet you warp to. So, for example, in a rifter, let's say there's like a gate camp and there's an interceptor that you want to kill. If you warp to this planet that's 72 AU away, if the interceptor follows you, even if all the other dudes follow you, by the time they land, you have like 20-30 seconds to fight the interceptor solo if he's trying to catch you. And oftentimes the other big ships won't follow you to the planet, and the interceptor will land on you, tackle you, and then he will call for help, and then they've got like a 72 AU warp, and which is going to take them like a minute before they can even arrive on grid.
If you know that that's a possibility, do you try and move whoever you have around grid, like purposely get them 100 km off of where they were originally, just to separate?
Yeah, just trying to manipulate people with positioning is the best way to catch fights. Knowing the top speeds of different ships and knowing how fast they warp and things like that are very important. So, for example, if there's a hurricane on a gate with an interceptor and you warp at 100 and the interceptor burns to you can guess that the hurricane is probably only going to move at like 1.3 kilometers a second, and it's not going to do any DPS to you before it gets it within 60 kilometers, which is just like max drone range. So you know that you've got like 20 seconds, 30 seconds to fight the interceptor before the hurricane can influence the fight.
You keep referring to knowing what all the ships do. Do you have some way of memorizing, like, how do you associate those bonuses to those frigates, or is there something as far as they're all relationally the same, or how do you remember that information other than play the game for 8 years?
It's really hard. It's kind of like Dota if you have never played it. But the best way I think is just to remember all the ship bonuses. And just a general idea of what the ship's role is. When CCP changed the overview icons, I think it would have been cooler if they added like some ISIS icons to them or something like that, so you can see what is a Logi and what is an attack frigate and things like that. But the best way to remember the frigates is there's only 12 of them. Well, you might see some other ones like Griffin and Crucifier, but generally there's a combat frigate that has a defensive bonus, there's a combat frigate that has all offensive bonuses, and there's an attack frigate for all races. So for the attack frigates, you have the Executioner for Amar, which has laser cap reduction and energy turret damage, and it has a utility high slot. And then you have the Atron, which it also has damage and fall off, I believe, and it has a utility high slot. Then you have the Slasher as well, which has tracking and damage, and then you have Condor, which just has damage. And then for the defensive bonus ones, you have Punisher for Amar, which has the armor resistances. You have Merlin, which has shield resistances. The Incursus, which has armor rep, and Breacher, which has shield rep. And then for offensive, there's Tormentor, it actually has the same bonuses as the Executioner. It just has energy cap and energy damage, but it does have 2 drones and an extra low. And Tristan is the offensive bonus one with 2 offensive bonuses. And then you have Rifter, which has 2 offensive bonuses, fall off and damage. And then last one, Kodai Kestrel, has rocket range and rocket damage. All the frigate missiles.
Do you feel like one is better than the other as far as dual damage bonuses versus one defensive, one offensive when you're fighting solo?
When I'm solo, to be honest, I really prefer the offensive bonus ones, like, for example, the Kestrel. Although it really depends on the ship. I think the Breacher is probably the strongest Minotaur frigate right now in the game. I think the Breacher, if you have max skills anyway, is better than the Rifter. And then the Merlin is quite good as well because it just has so much DPS. The weakness of the Merlin is how slow it is and the low projection it has.
About how far up the ship class chain do you think you can effectively fight one-on-one in a Tech 1 frig?
I think.
I apologize.
So for the most part, your main targets in a Tech 1 frigate are going to be frigates, interceptors. On a case-by-case basis, you can sometimes go for some other frigates, like an assault frigate. For example, I fought an NU in my Rifter video, and that's only because he had iron blasters, which don't have much range, so I could kite him at 8-9 kilometers. But for the most part, interceptors, frigates. There are some ships that are really weak to frigates, like the Zealot, for example, is a ship that's really powerful in fleets, but it doesn't have a utility high and it doesn't have any drones. So a Zealot will actually die to a Rifter after 20 minutes if you just orbit him at 500. And stealth bombers are another good target for you, as well as attack battle cruisers if you can catch them. Sometimes people are dumb and they'll just try to alpha you with a tornado or something, and if they're out of position and they're by themselves, you can kill them in a frigate quite easily. And in a frigate, you can still kill most industrial traffic. You can definitely kill Badger Mark IIs and things like that. Just watch out for bait Nereruses. You can also kill... Sorry.
Are there any situations where it's a clear cut that you can fight a destroyer?
Destroyer, they're very difficult, but I would say the two that you can fight, it depends on the ship. I think the only ones you can really fight destroyer-wise is when you're flying a ship with a projection bonus, like the Kestrel, for example. You can kill a Thrasher in a Kestrel because the Thrasher is basically forced to use barrage on you against your... And it has the same DPS as you, and it has a similar tank normally as well. And the same with the Catalyst, really. Coerce is really hard to fight because it has tracking and optimal. I wouldn't advise it. It can just load Scorch, or even if it has Tech 1 beams, it can still do damage to you. And all of the missile ones you want to avoid, as well as the 2 drone ones.
What do you think of pure kiting frigates like a kiting Condor or Tristan?
I think they're good, but I think they're not as good on lower SP characters, and I also think that a lot of the time in nullsec anyway, you're fighting against the clock. You're trying to kill some guy before his fleet comes to help him. So the fact that most kiting ships have lower DPS, I'm not sure what a Condor DPS does offhand, but I'm pretty sure it's 80 DPS, maybe a bit less. And being able to kill people before their friends show up is generally the biggest limiting factor, I think, flying a frigate in nullsec.
So what do you think are the biggest difference between the nullsec frigate meta and faction warfare in complexes and stuff?
Factional warfare, I think the players there use much more generalized hits that are much more suited for 1 versus 1s, but they're generally very weak to certain hard counters, and for example, the typical AB Scram Web factional warfare fit will get killed by a Condor easily. It'll just take the Condor 2 minutes to kill it or whatever. Whereas in nullsec, people fly more specialized fits. So for example, a tackle stiletto it's not a terrible fit, but it's weak in a 1v1 and it will be killed by a Rifter in a 1v1, for example. And I think players in nullsec generally are more organized and they use more specialized fits like this, like a stiletto, for example, that's designed for just being as effective as it is at its role, rather than being as generalized and not being as suited for fighting in a 1v1 scenario.
Are there any clear giveaways that someone doesn't know how to fly their ship and that you ought to take the fight?
0 transversal.
Outside of maybe that, and if you know what kind of guns they're using by looking at them. But I mean, just in I don't know, their tactics, the way they move, anything that just tells you that they don't know what they're doing?
I think it's mostly some positional stuff, like if a crow just approaches you in a rifter, then you know he's bad. But in general, I'm not too sure. I think it's mostly just like positioning stuff, like people not using their ship bonuses, like a crow approaching you, for example, or a malediction approaching you instead of kiting you if you're in like a blaster ship or an autocannon ship and things like that.
How often do you use things like kill boards to check like PvP history and fits?
Normally I do not use it, but I do use I use Pirate's Law Helper sometimes, and it really helps if you're deciding to go for like a harder fight. Like for example, if you wanted to fight a pirate frigate or a faction frigate like a comet, you could look them up on a kill board and see if their fit is bad or not, and that can help deciding to go for them or not.
Do you use other programs outside of just the basic E plant? Like, do you use, like you said, you use Pirates a little helper a little, but do you use anything else outside of like the base game client?
Not usually, no. I do often roam with like a Dotland tab, like just to check NPC kills in the in-game browser. Like being able to use like NPC kills, you can find places that are active on the map. You can also like research certain systems. So, for example, if you saw like there's 4 pod kills in the last hour in a system, you can then check like Z kill board or Dotland and see like what is the camp. Can I run that camp? What's happened there? Is it just like a random fight, or is it like a super annoying RSB gay camp that I'm gonna die to, and things like that. But I think Dotland and Pirate's Law Helper are probably the 2 biggest tools that I use, and I think they're the most useful.
Aside from things like fitting skills and that type, are there any that you feel are particularly crucial right out of the gate for anyone getting into a Tech 1 haul, just of prioritizing one specific thing over the other, like propulsion jamming and the like?
I think the most important skill in the game is thermodynamics right now. It's such a huge skill, it makes such a huge difference to everything. You have to train this skill, I think, to be competitive with PvP. Like just being able to heat, the difference between like the MWD speed, for example, is just huge. And like 15% DPS on guns is huge. I'm not sure how much total it is, but I think it's like 10% more rep, 10% less cycle time on shield boosters and armor repairers, which is like 21% better tank or something like that. Especially on ancillary boosters like ancillary armor repairer and the medium ancillary shield booster, because heating it gives 10% better. Gives 10% more HP, so essentially you're turning like your 9 charges into like almost 10 charges, like 9.9 charges. So it basically gives you an extra charge by overheating them.
Do you like to preheat your stuff? Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
How high do you need to train the skill off the start?
I would say that just level 2 is fine, but I think it's definitely a skill that you would like to invest to level 3 to level 4.
Do you preheat your stuff before you go into an engagement, or do you kind of like pick certain windows of opportunity, or wait until you really need it?
I think for the most part you preheat everything. In a frigate fight, it's normally over before you burn out your guns, for example, so you might as well just heat your guns for the whole fight. It's pretty likely that either you are going to be dead or your target is going to be dead before you burn out your guns, and you just want to overheat them for the entire fight. But as for MWD and Scram Web, I think just overheating and managing your MWD heat cycles is very important in the frigate, because there's only 3 safe heat cycles. Each cycle with an MWD with thermodynamics 5, I think it does something like 35% heat damage. So or maybe it's a bit more than that. But basically, if you take heat damage with your micro warp drive 3 times, then your micro warp drive will burn out. So you need to manage them effectively. Sometimes you'll get lucky and you won't take a heat cycle on your MWD. And actually, training for thermodynamics is pretty important for that because, like, reducing the residual damage that your MWD takes from the scram and web can really help you. By safe cycles, I mean like the minimum amount of time. If you get unlucky and it heats each time, so for example, for the micro warp drive, because it heats more than 33%, it will overheat in 3 cycles in the worst case. So you only have 2 safe cycles of heat. So when you're managing things like slingshotting interceptors or trying to slingshot kiters, you need to keep that in mind.
Just one question that the slingshot thing reminded me of. So I think in one of your videos, like you talked about the angular velocity while slingshotting. Like, do you find that angular velocity is more useful than transversal, just in general?
I think both are useful. If you look at them, both traversal and angular velocity basically mean the same thing. When you're trying to slingshot, you just want the number to go as close to 0 as possible, and that's when you want to turn around with a heated MWD cycle and try and get a heated scram and web on them.
Right, and then in terms of gun tracking, is it angular that's taken into account? Because a lot of people talk about transversal, but like in the stat page it says angular.
Traversal velocity is just the vector between you and your target, and angular velocity is the angle. I think angular velocity is more useful because it basically factors in the range between your target. So, for example, if you imagine you have a traversal of 1 kilometer a second to a guy, and you're 10 kilometers from him, that's a lot more effective at mitigating his DPS than having like a 1 kilometer a second traversal at 100 kilometers. Even though it will show you that you have a 1 kilometer a second traversal, you'll obviously be 10 times easier to hit at 100 kilometers if your target can hit out to that range. That's why I think angular velocity is easier to understand. Well, I personally use angular velocity, but traversal velocity is also useful. I think CCP didn't add. I think angular velocity was missing from the overview for quite a long time until like 2009 or something like that. So I think when older players talk about traversal, they're mostly people who played before like 2009 and they haven't switched over, or they're just people who learn from other people. But essentially, they're the same thing. Just you need to understand how traversal applies to range.
We have a question from Twitch. It's would someone want to go to nullsec if they got accepted? Oh, never mind. Wrong question. Ignore me.
Okay, are there any other questions?
Do you have any good tactics for disengaging if you need to?
For disengaging, the best way is probably to align out to an object and overheat your scram and web as you're getting towards the edge of scram and web range, because oftentimes your target will maybe forget to overheat the scram and web, and you can like keep them scrammed and webbed while you're moving away. Against kiters, it's a lot easier if you can do what is known as like a reverse slingshot. Basically, is where you like approach them, and then their ship orbit, if they're like doing AFK orbit, which is a lot of people kiters use, and then you just like burn away to a random celestial in the other direction, then you can warp away. But I don't think I've died to a kiting ship in a long time. Just if you can't get on top of them with heated scram and web, you can then just align in a celestial in the opposite direction to where that ship is in relation to you. And then because their orbit will be trying to take them as far away as you as possible until they get to like 20 kilometers or whatever their orbit is, you can normally escape quite easily. And when you're fighting against a brawling ship, the best case is normally just to try and align to an object, but it's a lot harder to get out when you're brawling. But if you're in a fast scram kiting ship like the Executioner, for example, oftentimes you're faster than a lot of your targets, so you can leave, especially if you like fight just on the edge of scram and web range.
Are there any other newbie fits that you're trying to throw together and see how they work?
Well, I've actually theory crafted quite a lot. I did do an Atron fit. I had an Atron character for a while, and I actually did kill like a 500 million Iskama in that character. But the thing with the Atron that I found was that with blasters, it's a lot harder to use tactics because even if you're fighting against like a laser ship that's made a mistake by approaching you, because of his DPS is basically similar to you. So even with blasters, it's a lot harder to win against ships. Whereas with Pulse, like if you're against like a veteran that's made a mistake and you're able to kite him at 9 kilometers with Scourge, it's a lot easier to win that fight than it is to like kill some of the blasters at 1 kilometer. Which is mostly why I didn't use blasters in any of my videos yet. But I did have quite a lot of successful kills, but it was mostly like just killing kiters rather than like having any successful fights with brawling ships. I also did a dual prop slasher as well, which worked out quite well. I did get quite a few kills on it, but it was really complicated, and I thought it was too complicated for new players to understand how to micromanage this ship effectively, because there was so much going on with dual prop, and it also had like a small auxiliary armor repairer, and it had bad cap, and so like, being able to like manage traversal while also managing a dual prop, while also managing charges, while also managing your cap, I felt like it was too complicated, and I didn't think it would be very useful for new players. I think it would probably be too hard for them to understand, and it would probably end up confusing them more.
So I got a couple questions for you. One, someone who's new to PvP has thermodynamics at 4. Is it worth them to train it up to 5 at all?
I think thermodynamics 5 is a really useful skill, but I think it's on a case-by-case basis. Because thermodynamics basically reduces the heat damage you take each cycle by 5%. So going from level 4 to 5 reduces it from 80% to 75% less heat damage. It does make quite a considerable difference, but I think it makes a bigger difference on bigger ships like cruisers or battleships rather than frigates.
And another one is people have commented and complained about assault frigates being crap. What are your thoughts on it? And do you think that there is any reason for them to be at such a quote-unquote low state?
I think the problem with assault frigates right now is that tactical destroyers do everything that they do but better. They have better tank, they have better speed when in propulsion mode for the most part, and they also have better projection than them. Like for example, a Jackdaw can do more DPS at the same range as a Harpy with better tank and almost the same speed. I think assault frigates kind of need a new role. I think they all have a utility high, so I think maybe giving them a bonus to fitting Nosferatu, or maybe giving them like a really cool weird Intellisis bonus would be fun, or something like that. I think they just need some more speed to put them right now, because they're slower than tactical destroyers, and they're also slower than interdictors as well. Why would you ever fly a Jaguar if you can fly a Saber, which has like the same stats as a Jaguar, that also has a bubble, so it's more useful to fleet, and it's more useful 1v1 as well because of the fall off bonus.
And another question is, these are all unrelated obviously, but for a new player, do you think it's better for them to go and try to do PvP in low sec systems, or do you think it should be going straight into null sec where there's no rules?
I think it's easier to get kills in null sec because of the way people fit their ships. I think as I mentioned, in low sec people use more generalized fits, and they're fits that are designed to fight 1v1. While in 0-0 there's a lot more people flying ships like stilettos and crows and things like that are designed to tackle people as effectively as possible, but not to fight in a 1v1 scenario.
I have one more for you, and a little bit long, so just forgive me. Now, with the changes in SOV coming up, and citing a recent roam that Waffles took out, we had a lot of fun trying to use Entosis mechanics with a large frigate gang. Do you see that sort of thing as a sign of positive changes for Tech 1 frigate use in the new SOB mechanic, or do you think that they're on the downslope, or how do you see it going forward?
Do you mean for like getting fights for small groups and solo, or
with most of nullsec PvP being very Tech 3 and cruiser dominant, do you think there's going to be a resurgence in the amount of Tech 1 frig that's being used?
I'm not too sure, to be honest. I don't really play in like sovereignty alliances and things like that. I think frigates can be really useful for the Entosis link. I actually have had a lot of success in the past few days using a claw with an Entosis link fitted for like baiting out fights, because it sends a alliance-wide mail, and as soon as people see like an interceptor intosising their station services, they get really butt mad about it, and they come out and fight you. And the claw and some other ships that are really good at it, like the slicer, ships that are quite fast, even with the mass penalty of the Entosis link, you can typically like burn out and burn away from many counters to you, like take 3 destroyers and orifices and things like that.
Do you think that Tech 1 frigates are in a better place than they have been versus a few years ago?
Oh yeah, definitely. Ever since Retribution, and then to a later extent, the Rubicon, I think it was Rubicon 1.2 point release, that was I remember it because it was like during the New Eden Open. But I think the vast majority of the frigates right now are really strong, and they're all viable. The only one that I think that is in a really terrible place right now is the Punisher. I think it should probably be like changed to a rocket ship. The Punisher's really bad right now because it only has 2 mids, and it has a lot of cap problems, and it's forced to brawl with the utility high. And it would make more sense if it was like a rocket ship, because having like a 3rd laser ship when the Tormentor and the Executioner already are very good and already cover like fast laser ship with utility high, which is the Executioner, and the Tormentor is like it has like 4 lows and it has 2 drones. It's sort of like the laser DPS mainline ship. I don't think there's really a role for the Punisher because you can basically like just put 2 drones on a Tormentor and then just do a max tank Tormentor, and it'll be like a better bait tackler than the Punisher is anyway.
Are there any changes that you'd like to see to Tech 1 frigs across the whole spectrum?
I'm not too sure, to be honest. I think the Tech 1 figures are in a very healthy place right now. I think the Tristan is a little too strong right now. I think that maybe just taking a bit of speed off of the Tristan would be perfectly fine, because it's faster than the vast majority of frigates in the game, while doing like brawling DPS at kiting ranges. But it's actually getting nerfed indirectly due to the drone damage nerf, which will nerf like I think it's 7% less DPS on the 2 DDA kiting Tristan. So that will make a difference. I think making it a bit slower so they'll get caught more reliably by ships like the Tormentor and Merlin, Kestrel, things like that would make it a bit more balanced. I think all the other ships are okay. I think the Rifter and the Slasher are currently a bit undervalued, and I think they just need a bit more fittings, just like 5 CPU, 2 grid or something like that, just so it's a bit easier to fit the Rifter and the Slasher. They really struggle to fit utility highs in competitive fits. And then the one I mentioned, which is the only frigate that I think is really bad right now, is the Punisher, which I think it should be redesigned to a rocket frigate, because there isn't really an armor rocket frigate right now. And it would make logical sense to have the Punisher as a stepping stone into the Vengeance, and also as a lesser extent to the Malediction and the Heretic.
Does anyone have any final questions? No? Okay. Suitonia, do you have any final thoughts, advice, things that you may have forgot to mention at the start or just realized in the course of the conversation would be worth mentioning now?
I think it's worth always just trying out solo PvP. Just like get 5 Rifters. If you need, if you want some ships, if you just send a mail to Suitonia in game, I have like 200 Rifters that are fitted, and I'll just send you like 3 or 5. If you just want some free Rifters, if you just want to try out some solo PvP sometime, and you don't want to spend 15 million to fit it out, I think just trying and just minimizing the time between your deaths is a good way. And just what I mean is just like take away the pain of losing ships as much as possible by having replacements already ready and them being cheap to lose.
You're now going to get like 500 emails about free Rifters. Just want to point that out.
Well, that's fine. I really need to get rid of these Rifters anyway, because they're like clogging up my jitter hanger.
To the Ascendant?
Just send a mail to Suitonia if you want to try PvP and you just want a couple of rifters or whatever. I've got like 200 of them fitted, so I just like send 5 of them to like the first 40 people who mail me.